Welcome along, everybody, today to a webinar, Cash, Coins, Crypto and Collectibles, Not All Money is Created Equal. I'd like to welcome on board Carl Rayner. Thank you for joining me today, Carl.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
No worries. So people often ask me the question as to how do I choose when it comes to those who jointly present with me. Well, it's quite simple, without giving away too much. As a 48-year-old, approaching 49 and nearing that part of my life where words like crypto are strange to me, I need to bring in the young guns who are all over this sort of stuff, and Carl deals with this on a daily basis, and so there's a number of areas that I'm going to defer to Carl because his knowledge is certainly better than mine, and we can work through it together. So thanks for joining me, Carl. So today, what we're trying to do, or what we really want to engage with, is it's not so much a presentation about how cryptocurrency works as such. It's really a collection on how all of these issues come together and work from an SMSF compliance point of view. And so it's really more about how we can address the various issues of self-managed super fund compliance and how they link together, given that all of these investment types and these investment styles are somewhat related to the concept of mediums of exchange as such, and people will often use concepts like gold for exchange, certainly cryptocurrency from an exchange point of view. But from a pure regulatory point of view in the SMSF space, all of these assets are treated very differently, and so we want people to have a greater understanding of how the rules work. So we certainly encourage any questions that people have throughout the presentation. From a learning outcomes point of view, I've only highlighted 3 issues there, which we will certainly focus on throughout the presentation, and that is the acquisition rules, which is a pretty critical thing for me, and really it is the first and foremost investment concept that we need to always get our head around. Of course, we'll touch on sole purpose test and a few other elements as well with regards to it. But also, I'll finish with the audit requirements. So I'm going to touch on audit throughout the presentation and what we would like to see from an audit point of view. But I've got just a very small checklist, obviously, albeit sort of a collection of the questions that we get asked from our auditors here. But a collection of the requirements for holding sort of currency-based investments with a bit of a focus, I guess, in many respects on the cryptocurrency requirements. And of course, which assets are subject to CGT and which are not. And in simple terms, most of the things we talk about today are actually linked to capital gains tax. So that certainly sort of covers that, but it's also a general awareness about it, that we're not talking about money so much in the sense that it's income generating and no CGT, and that all of these assets, all these asset types do have a link to capital gains tax, and certainly from the advice point of view, that people need to be mindful of that as they're moving forward. But we're going to discuss some other elements, and certainly I want to touch on, I guess, what I call the speculative side of some of these investments, and those that monitor this area pretty closely, those particularly in regards to cryptocurrency. You would have heard or read in the last sort of 3 to 4 weeks, more specifically, about some things called non-fungible tokens, and I think I've got that right, NFTs, and NFTs are, well, let's just say they're crypto assets, because that is effectively what they are. And from a regulatory point of view, I think it's something that we're going to have to all start to contemplate and get our heads around. But I want to speculate a little bit where that sits in a regulatory environment, because I see there are some key weaknesses in our legislation at the moment. If, as is likely to occur, these things become an asset that the SMSF trustees at least contemplate investing in. And so, just like cryptocurrency when it came about, we need to be prepared from both an administrative point of view, a systems point of view, and an audit point of view to deal with these investments. And a lot of that will stem from the regulators' understanding on it, and how we adapt our processes to deal with the obvious reporting obligations and things that come about from it. So all of these are key issues that we will talk about. But as I sort of have alluded to, this is more generalistic from a conversation piece about the overall investment objectives of a self-managed superannuation fund. And so we have to take it back to a very, I guess, broad position as to what we're actually looking for from an SMSF point of view and what an SMSF can invest in. And what we all know from day dot is an SMSF can invest in pretty much anything that an individual can invest in, but it is subject to certain investment restrictions, certain prohibitions, and we need to make sure that when we're advising in this space, when we're administering and all those other elements, that we are making sure that our number one message is how somebody satisfies those audit requirements, but more specifically the SIS regulatory requirements, because tax and all those other elements are a flow on from the fund getting its expenses and things correct up front. So I think it's key that we understand that we've got investment restrictions around there, and that we have to give consideration to, obviously from a first point of view, the fund's investment strategy, and we'll touch on that in a moment. I'm going to have a chat with Carl about a scenario that he came across recently from from an audit point of view, and I'll rebuke a couple of his comments with reference to sort of the two-way conversation there. But the fund investment strategy is such a critical document now, and you only have to go back to our February webinar when we talked about the investment strategy of the fund and the key requirements from a documentation point of view, but just what we have to go through from a consideration point of view. And I think, broadly speaking, when we're talking about collectible and personal use assets, and when we're talking about cryptocurrencies, but also when we're talking about gold and precious metals from an investment point of view, the capacity to identify them either as an asset class and from a percentage point of view benchmarking that, or from an asset specifically, we have to take that into consideration. And I think that's where you had a trustee recently, Carl, who they did that. What did they invest in again? What were you telling me they were investing in?
Yeah, so we had a trustee recently complete a new investment strategy.
Yep.
They chose their asset diversification on a broad range. So they didn't give specific asset ranges for each asset class.
Yep.
We had the auditor come back questioning the validity of that because the fund made majority in precious metals.
Yep.
So it had a small cash holding and the rest was all in gold and silver bullions.
Yeah. Okay. And I think the point that you were saying to me was that they hadn't, whilst they hadn't put ranges in there, they also hadn't identified specifically that they were going to have a large or significant portion of their holding in those precious metals. Was that the point, the main point of it?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, okay. And I think the key to that, and the comments that I came back to Carl on that was, if we go back to when the ATO did their audit review, for want of a better term, of the limited recourse borrowing arrangements almost a couple of years ago now, the key issue there that the ATO wanted to highlight, and when they then released investment strategy documentation on their website, they said you don't need to put asset classes in there. You don't need to put percentages as such, but if you don't, you need to broadly identify how the assets that you have will help you satisfy your investment objectives. And you certainly, if those assets are form a significant portion of the fund strategy, that you need to identify those assets. So given that the precious metals made up a large portion of the fund's investments, I think it's the right approach from the auditor to say, look, I think the SMSF trustees need to address this and identify that they're investing in this particular class for a very specific reason. So one of those key issues. Of course, the other part of it, part of the investment strategy, and look, I'll come back to this conversation piece throughout the presentation, but obviously that any of these investments are undertaken in consideration or contemplation of the sole purpose test. And look, for as many years as I've been presenting, I often try to play the arch nemesis of the sole purpose test from an SMSF point of view. because the sole purpose test is what it is in regards to the fund is there to provide for the members' benefits upon retiring or turning 65, or for their beneficiaries if they die prior to that. That's our primary or our core purpose of the fund. We've then got the peripheral ancillary benefits associated with it. But then what we have to justify is that every transaction is undertaken for the purpose of meeting those objectives of providing for retirement. And of course, it's incumbent on the trustees to satisfy that explanation that what they are doing is to meet that requirement and not for some other benefit, and certainly not for some current day benefit. And this is where these sorts of investments that we're touching on today, whether they be digital style investments, whether they be collectible style investments, they have that current day allure, current day benefit linked to them, or or what I almost call that emotional connection. And this is where I struggle. I've always struggled with the sole purpose test, is that often investments actually do have an emotional link, and that's why people undertake them. They have this emotional link to it, to understand it enough to invest in it, and therefore produce those returns for the superannuation fund. But ultimately, from a sole purpose test point of view, and therefore link back to the investment strategy, the real key to that matter or that issue is identifying that that's why you're doing it. Not saying I invest in wine because I like to have a tipple or two on the weekend, because clearly that's one of those scenarios that says, well, okay, well, is that actually a good investment for your self-managed super fund? Side note, it's certainly not a good investment for my self-managed super fund to do that. So, understanding all those issues there, but also then being a little bit more specific that the super fund must obviously satisfy the collectible and personal use asset rules. And, we're a good 5 years past the final point of the introduction of those rules, which came in 2016. And so now we're at the space where everybody's operating under the same collectible and personal use asset rules. And so clearly from an audit point of view, we're well past the point of people not understanding what they need to do for certain collectibles and personal use assets. And if we're talking about certain coins and certain banknotes, as we will through the presentation, then they come under that definition, versus gold bullion, which is not a collectible and personal use asset, albeit that in some ways, in many respects, it is. But it's almost like, what assets got put on the hit list and what assets didn't, and self-satisfaction of those that didn't mean the regulatory obligations aren't as significant. And these are the sorts of things that have to be taken into consideration. So the broad brush of that slide is really ultimately that whether we're talking about foreign currency or local currency, precious metals, collectibles, cryptocurrencies, these are all eligible investments. And to the point that I'm going to talk about later, non-fungible tokens, right? I'll get that right. Non-fungible tokens, and I'll explain a little bit later, everybody. In theory, are eligible investments for a self-managed super fund to undertake, but it's going to be a little bit problematic in the sense of some of the satisfaction of other rules and requirements for superannuation funds. So we need to have all of those considerations, and then once we've considered it, then we need to be satisfied that that these assets or any assets would satisfy potentially related party acquisition rules. And I think one of the questions, and albeit this is probably going to be a one-word answer from you, Carl, but how many times have you had the question, can I transfer Bitcoin into my self-managed super fund?
Too much.
Yeah, too much. So, and so, the reality is we're going to see more people ask these sorts of questions because they potentially got into cryptocurrency in the very early days and now think, well, maybe that would be wise to have in my self-managed superannuation fund, or they've got collectible and personal use assets sitting outside their fund and they want to look at bringing them in. And we have to be clear with how the rules actually work in this space. And I think particularly as we move away from, I almost hate using this, but as we move away from the physical, in the sense of assets, and we move into the digital realm of both means of exchanges, currencies, assets, and other things, then our legislation, all these rulings, all these other key issues that we deal with, you know, they've got to adapt a lot quicker than they have historically, because I find that, you know, you create this problem where it's that whole concept of anything new, you're always going to get the early adopters, right? And as we see self-managed super fund, and as we see the age of establishment for self-managed super funds become younger, what that inevitably means is that the investments of choice for a lot of those participants and those new trustees will be very different to the old stock standard SMSF that was being set up when I first started in the industry. And so, you know, we have to be ready and prepared to adapt to those things a lot quicker. So when we look at things like the acquisition of asset rules, whilst I don't see any change appearing in this space, and I think that can often be a good thing, the reality that the good thing is that we've still got these rules, because they tried to even remove these acquisitions from related party rules many years ago, is that we have to satisfy this concept that we can't intentionally acquire an asset from a related party unless it satisfies one of the exceptions. But that definition of acquire an asset doesn't include accepting money, which then means we need to know what it means to accept money. And when you on face value, when you look at the word cryptocurrency, the first thing you see there is currency. Well, the first thing you see is crypto, but in amongst it you see the word currency, and so that is a means of exchange. And ultimately, you know, we can look at various rulings that and tax determinations that the ATO released, and we can look at where crypto sits in the SMSF space right now. But let's be honest, cryptocurrency wasn't created to be an investment, right? Cryptocurrency was created to be a means of exchange. Right now, whether the intentions behind the means of exchange were always good intentions, right? We appreciate that there are certainly very reputable people that use cryptocurrency, but we also know the statistics have shown us that there is that place, I think they call it the dark net, the dark web, where you know, there are services and acquisitions and that are going on, and the whole decentralized nature of cryptocurrencies provided for the capacity to buy and sell goods without obvious identification, which was a clear opportunity that people were addressed and identified and saw as a way to be able to transact without government regulation, without government sort of having that big brother approach to these transactions. And I think the irony of all that is that now we see people investing in these currencies through a self-managed superannuation fund. So they're trying to avoid government regulation. And what do? They invest it via a vehicle that is very heavily regulated by the government. And so it comes across a bit of an interesting space. But this SMSF ruling 2010-1 does expand on the concept of accepting money. And what it talks about in there is obviously that our cash payments, be it via Australian, so local currency, or foreign currency, either directly by handing over cash, which is very rarely done these days, but more likely via EFT, is effectively accepting money, and so therefore it's okay. So there is a capacity to utilise foreign currency as much as Australian: bank checks, personal checks, and promissory notes. The ruling does go on to expand about our collectible banknotes and coins, and whilst it talks about those coins, if the value of those coins and notes is greater than the face value, then it is a collectible, or a collectible banknote, and therefore is not cash, which is not considered acceptable under the concept of accepting money. So it limits us to modern day or current day currency. And when we were going through this presentation, I was talking to Carl and others about it, and saying that, you know, as a child, I remember very distinctly all of my Prince Charles and Princess Di 50-cent pieces, and the Commonwealth Games or Olympics 50-cent pieces, and I thought they were all, you know, worth a staggering amount of money. Turns out they're all worth 50 cents, as it was. And so, you know, the concept of what is a collectible coin, you know, is in itself based on, are others willing to pay you more than 50 cents for that particular coin? And so obviously issues like rarity, condition, all of those sorts of elements. And I take a lot of my cues. I don't watch a lot of reality TV, but I've seen that show Pawn Stars, which is PAWN for everybody listening online. And of course, often a lot of people bring in old coins and they need to get them valued, and it comes down to condition and all those sorts of things. And it's quite ironic again that those sorts of transactions in the SMSF space are actually, I think, ultimately more susceptible to valuation discrepancies and things than potentially now cryptocurrencies, and that where we're seeing more and more legitimized markets in place, more brokers that are set up and established in accordance with the rules around self-managed superannuation funds. So albeit that the valuations fluctuate quite dramatically, the capacity to obtain a valuation is far easier and far more cost effective for a self-managed super fund than potentially our collectible and personal use assets. And I think they're the key issues to be mindful of. So from a summarization of the acquisition rules, no other sort of currency or monetary or exchange-based asset can be acquired from a related party. It's a full stop point. At that point, no collectible personal use assets can be acquired from a related party. Now that point, there was some historical conjecture, and I don't always want to bring up issues from the past that are no longer relevant, but when we had this ruling finalised, there was actually in the original draft version of this ruling was because under the acquisition of assets from related parties, you can acquire certain in-house assets. Right? And as you know, in-house assets include loans to related companies and trusts, and they include investments in related companies and trusts. But in-house asset also includes an asset subject to a lease to a related party. Now, when we look at all of these assets subject to release to related parties used to be artwork, collectibles, all those sorts of things. And so in the original draft, sort of before 2009, it was quite common to see self-managed super funds acquiring artwork and other collectible style investments from the members on the provision that those assets were then leased back to the members. So the super fund would buy it and then lease it back. ATO excluded that, and I think that was the right decision, because ultimately what it came down to were people were just transferring all of their wealth from outside of super to inside of super by the use of setting up a lease arrangement. And that wasn't the objective of superannuation. So that collectible and personal use asset still can lead 10 years later to questions being asked as to whether people can address it. So it is a key area for us to be mindful of. And so before we get into, I guess, the key issues associated with some of these types of investment, one of the areas that I want to address is clearly the taxation. And if we address it from a point of view of, it's probably easier for me to say, okay, well, Australian cash is not subject to capital gains tax, right? But ultimately, really what it is that gold and other precious metals are all subject to CGT. Now, I've identified there bullion and referencing it as both as bars and ingots and coins as such, but I've also identified jewelry, because even though jewelry is a collectible and personal use asset under the definition, obviously jewelry is also largely made up of precious metals, and so the value in that jewelry is linked often to the value of the gold or silver or whatever else attributable to it. And I guess where we talk about jewelry from an SMSF point of view, it comes back to that conversation or that concept I mentioned before, which is that it's more of an emotional attachment, right? So there's an emotional attachment to certain pieces of jewelry for certain reasons, whereas from a sole purpose test point of view, the attachment's got to be in the value linked to the metals or stones or whatever that are held within that piece of jewelry, as that's what the true value is. And ultimately the buyer, any buyer at the end of the day, is really after that value, not whether or not it was grandma's or somebody else in the sense of the family connection and those sorts of other elements. And that's, again, that link, that's my first reference back to the sole purpose test, is that's the link to the sole purpose test is not what's the sentimental value behind the investment, is what is the opportunity for us, A, to be able to easily turn this investment into liquidity for the purposes of paying future benefits, right? And B, you know, how quickly can that be done? So is it a liquid or liquid simple to liquidate investment, and is there a market for it, right? And crypto, there's a market for, right? But that market does fluctuate, and it often fluctuates on speculation and other sorts of things. As we talk about these NFTs, these non-fungible tokens soon, there is a market. That market inevitably, in my mind, will fluctuate. And so, you know, for self-managed super funds to contemplate these gold investments, they need to be mindful of it. And I've just put that image up there of that tax determination from 2014, which was TD 2014-26. And I guess that was the critical point from a cryptocurrency point of view, to get finality from the tax office as to how it was going to be treated from a taxation point of view. The speculation, I mean, you know, crypto or Bitcoin, if we talk about it, ultimately was introduced in about 2008, 2009 in rough sort of terms. Self-managed super funds, probably my first interaction with the concept of Bitcoin came around that 2011, 2012 time. And that came about because of somebody I was working with at the time who liked to look at, I guess, some non-standard investments, and came up to me and said, "Look, oh, Tim, you know, what's your understanding or what's your appreciation for acceptance of self-managed super funds investing in Bitcoin?" And of course, I answered, "Oh, look, I'm exceptionally busy. I need to get back to you on that," which is code for I need to go and Google what Bitcoin is and look it up. But ultimately, I sort of said, okay, well, it's obviously being addressed as a currency. I said, there's no way I can see any government sort of saying it is a currency. And so I think you have to treat it like an equity and say, okay, well, it's going to have a capital gain or whatever attributable to it. Now, that wasn't just me coming up with that. That was me reading other people's assessments of that at the time as well. I mean, I could claim it, it's 10 years ago, no one would know any different, but accepting of peers of mine and what their opinions were of the time as well, I said, this is where I see it sitting. And of course, it took the ATO a little bit of time to finalise their position, but by 2014, they came out and said, yes, it is a CGT-based asset. So that at least gives us capacity and understanding that from a buy-sell point of view, you are buying and selling cryptocurrency for the purposes of making profit or gain, not from a generating income, because it is not an income-producing asset. It is effectively something that's sitting there on semi-regulated, unregulated type markets for people to utilise. Value 100% determined by speculation and, you know, things that occur around the world or whatever that might trigger issues. But for me, what was a key, and this is where I'm going to in a moment get Carl to come in with some terminology and explanation around some of the key issues. But at the same time as that CGT bulletin was released, they also released this bulletin 2014/25, which posed the question, is Bitcoin a foreign currency? And so that went through the whole process really of identifying what a cryptocurrency was. And this is my first introduction to the concept of, okay, well, Bitcoin itself was actually introduced as a personal use asset, right? So it was introduced for the capacity for people to use it for whatever means, for their own enjoyment, but ultimately to go out and buy things on certain markets from certain traders who would trade in Bitcoin, right? And there was some underlying value associated with it. I think I remember at the time also of this, there used to be like the Big Mac index or whatever with cryptocurrency, and people, like they do with other things, they would say, okay, well, the Big Mac costs X amount of Bitcoin or whatever. And then as Bitcoin value increased, you know, the how much you needed to buy a Big Mac obviously decreased from a Bitcoin point of view. But, you know, there's always conversations around could you use Bitcoin to buy property and other things? And that, in a way, is what links us into this non-fungible tokens, which we'll touch on, as I said. But that concept of actually linking cryptocurrencies to a specific asset has started its evolution in around that 2014 time, and is now just starting to peak based on a couple of crazy transactions that we'll talk about in a moment. But, you know, one of the things that I guess one of my key messages that I want to address when we talk about cryptocurrency as an investment for self-managed super funds is we get a little bit lazy and we start talking about Bitcoin. But my point to that second dot there is that talking about cryptocurrency as Bitcoin is like talking about the stock exchanges, BHP. Bitcoin is, as I put down the bottom of the slide there, it's one of 4,500 cryptocurrencies. Now, the majority of that 4,500 are useless, pointless, worthless. That's my personal opinion, possibly backed up by many other people as well. But anyone can create a cryptocurrency. You know, it's then got to be assigned some form of value to it. And some of the readings I've done suggests that the top 20 cryptocurrencies represent basically 90% of all transactions and ownership in regards to this space. So there's a lot of people that would use these things for all sorts of various purposes, but they don't have the recognition that Bitcoin would necessarily have. So that's why we talk largely through Bitcoin, and I suspect over time that even the ATO's language and other language will move away from just referencing Bitcoin and talking exclusively about cryptocurrency. But the foreign currency determination was really a key determination to talk about the fact that, yes, it is used from an exchange point of view, but it's either got to be identified as a personal use asset or as an investment. And clearly from an SMSF point of view, the ATO ultimately, for me at that point, drew the line in the sand to say it is an investment, it is not a personal use asset. So it doesn't fit under that SMSF ruling 2010-1 as a accepting money concept. Now, for me to ask you or anybody, do you think that'll change, is purely speculative. But surely it has to. I mean, it's one of those things that as we continue to evolve, digital currencies have to be recognised in some way, shape or form, and self-managed super funds will be able to use them for more and more transactions, and therefore how that dictates regulatory issues, time will tell. But it's a tough area. I'm not sure if you've got any other comments on that or whether you agree sort of roughly with what I'm saying there.
No, I definitely agree with that. And yeah, hearing Bitcoin referencing all cryptocurrencies is definitely a common one. So trying to correct that and give that education there is definitely important, so we can recognize the value of these other coins as well as Bitcoin itself.
Yeah, and I mean, I know when we were talking, when we were preparing for this, you said that of the funds, and Carl deals with a lot of our direct clients, and I think you put a percentage roughly on funds that invest in collectible personal use assets, cryptocurrencies, and that represented a percentage. What was the number you're telling me of funds?
Yeah, so of our direct client base, we're looking at about 10% of these funds hold your collectibles, cryptocurrencies, precious metals.
Yeah, but if it's anything like a lot of the other sort of unique style investments, they might represent 10% of the funds, but I'm sure it doesn't represent 10% of the questions that you get asked on a daily basis.
No, it's definitely much higher in terms of question.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, and we're about to I guess move on to some of the key issues about holding cryptocurrency inside a self-managed superannuation fund. And this is where I'm going to ask Carl to give a couple of, I guess, explanations around a few key issues. But it's interesting to note that once we start to talk about, say, the audit requirements, and once we've talked a little bit about the storage stuff in a moment, you know, just to go through a couple of the styles of questions that people ask and what that actually means from a transaction point is fairly critical. And so I just wanted to touch on the first point there, which is the separation of assets, because to me, that's where, if we go back to say 2012 onwards, when people started dealing in this space, we didn't know what we were about to be hit with from an influx of investments and trustees dabbling in this space and potentially putting large sums of money into it. And so we certainly didn't have the capacity that we do now through a number of the various online brokers and that in the crypto space, where separation of asset, I suspect from an audit point of view, was exceptionally troubling. Because people would firstly go out and buy these assets. They would just transfer money, whether from their self-managed super fund or elsewhere. The naming conventions, well, let's say there weren't any naming conventions ultimately at that point in time. And so then the onus of proof was about identifying those assets as being paid for from the self-managed super fund and being able to track those transactions. Now, time has healed some of those issues, but I suspect, like with all existing assets in self-managed super, not all. So not all trustees would do the right thing, and some would still hold it in their individual names. So I guess the key issue from a separation of assets point of view is that our trustees need to understand that if they're going to hold these crypto investments, and they're going to hold some personally and in the super fund, that if they've got wallets, and Carl will give us an explanation of that in a moment, that they've got separate ones for the self-managed super fund and for individuals. And that let me then throw over to Carl, because one of the key issues about crypto storage and holding crypto inside a self-managed super fund is how you actually hold it. And so I'd love to get Carl to explain to the concept of hot and cold, and what that means. And a key note for this is that, unlike myself, like you don't have like warm wallets, which is like my wallet where it sits is generally always warm. Forget that. It's got nothing to do with that, albeit that in some respects a cold wallet is almost like my wallet, because you can potentially carry it around with you. But Carl, over to you, just to give a bit of explanation about storage.
Yeah, of course. So when you're holding cryptocurrency, there's a number of ways you can do it. The preferable way for an SMSF, and the way that we always like to see clients hold it and the auditors like to see, is through an exchange. So that's generally going to be referred to as a hot wallet. It's connected to the internet at all times. So I suppose you could say temperature-wise, it's hot when the computer's turned on. Similarly, you can have a hot wallet on your own computer, so if it's not held through an exchange. Otherwise, some clients also do like to use what's called a cold wallet or cold storage. So your cold wallets can literally be something like a USB, where you've downloaded your cryptocurrencies and you've then unplugged it from the computer. So you can carry it around like Tim does with his, and it would be cold because it's never connected to the internet unless you plug it in.
Just to jump in, when Carl said like Tim carries his, that's how Tim carries his wallet, not how Tim carries his crypto, because Tim has no crypto.
Yes. Yeah. Another form of cold storage that can be utilized as well is using what's called an air-gapped computer. So it's going to throw you back to the 80s, maybe even early 90s, where you've got a computer that's not connected to the internet, and that's where you've transferred your cryptocurrencies to hold them. So the definition of hot and cold, the easiest way is to consider hot being connected to the internet, whereas cold is disconnected.
Yeah, so this is where it gets really interesting, because when you read all of the, I guess when you read Geeks R Us or something like that as a website or one of these sorts of places, you know, the crypto world loves a cold storage, right?
Yeah.
They love a cold storage because the whole reason that they invest in these sorts of things is they don't trust anybody. And quite rightly, what they identify is that I think it's with hot storage, obviously you're susceptible to hacking. And obviously this is what we've seen happen, right, in the history of largely Bitcoin, but certainly some of the other less reputable ones early, was significant hacking of the exchanges and the hot wallet, I'm going to call it for want of better terms, and people stealing cryptocurrencies, and so the hardcore operators, they want that cold storage so that they can effectively carry it around. And I guess that was the irony of my warm wallet joke, is that if they're always carrying the cold one in their pocket, then it's going to get relatively warm anyhow. But it is that they've always got it with them, but it's not connected to anything. So if they have to transact, then they do have to connect, transact, and then jump out of it. And we'll touch on that sort of stuff. I'll get you to touch on that from an audit point of view shortly, Carl. But I think that's a key issue, because clearly if we've got SMSFs investing in these things, you know, we can't tell them they have to hold their investments hot or cold. We can identify from a regulatory point of view the benefits associated with a hot storage via an exchange where we can log in and look at the effectively the public address, the public key or whatever. By entering that, we can get access to, and the advisor, the auditor, can get access to the holdings at a point in time, get access to the transaction statement. And so it's very clear. But of course, from the investor's point of view, they want the security that the cold storage provides. Of course, with that security comes the risk that it is password driven. And of course, rule number one about passwords is don't use password as the password. But rule number two is always remember your password. And you know, I'm not sure what experience, and maybe you haven't had any in this space yet, Carl, but what experience we've had of clients that forget their passwords and things. And you know, do we have any recommendations for people who, because clearly they're not going to give us their password, I presume, and clearly they're not going to give the auditors their password. So, what suggestions would you have, if any, for trustees that are going down this path when they're looking between hot and cold?
Yeah, of course. So hot wallets we would generally be preferring because it's much easier to confirm holdings and transactions. And it is very secure in terms of the security that a lot of the exchanges are putting in place now. Cold storage does carry higher risk because, as you said, with password protection, you can forget your password, and it is something we have seen happen.
Right.
So those assets, if you've forgotten your password and you've been locked out, you're then effectively going to be looking at writing off that cryptocurrency investment, and you'll need to, the auditors will be asking you to sign a declaration saying, I've lost the password, I can't recover it, this asset now needs to be written off at this price.
Well, okay, so and that's the experience we've seen from where it's happened in the past.
Yeah, it is. So we've had one happen and the client lost their password. The auditors were saying that if you sign the declaration, you'll obviously get your audit contravention report, but it will be at least a rectified contravention. If the clients weren't willing to sign that declaration, that contravention would be ongoing until such point that they do sign a declaration and write off the investment.
Wow, it's an interesting area, and I think you know, one to be able to ponder over, you know, even longer periods of time, and as we see more cases arise. But there's a huge leap of faith there in accepting a declaration. In theory, we're asking all trustees to be honest in all matters all the time anyhow.
Yes.
There's a huge leap of faith to suggest that I've forgotten my password and I'm declaring that I've forgotten my password, because what happens if they remember their password? Because if they remember that password in the future and they still have their little USB and the asset's been written off from an SMSF point of view, and let's just take one step further, let's say they never separated their assets in the first place, so they had an original declaration of separation of assets in place, and so it conjures up all of these high risk elements for auditors to contemplate, and I think that they are more likely to be qualifying their audit reports with regards to cryptocurrencies, because they cannot, in every set of circumstances, be satisfied with all the information they're being provided. So yeah, look, it's a really interesting thing, and so we've got this fact sheet, cryptocurrency investments for self-managed super funds. That's actually that'll go up online onto our website after today's webinar, and we'll also shoot through, when we send through CPD, we'll send through a link to that to you all as well, which should give you a bit of an identification, understanding as to some of the key issues that we're going to talk about. But that leads me to the whole, what does the future hold? And to talk about the future, I think we need to go back to the past a little bit and reference a couple of key things, because as I said before, this whole presentation is around the various styles of investment, and I'm going to touch specifically in the last few minutes on gold and various ways we can hold gold and precious metal investments point of view. But there's a link now, to me, between cryptocurrency and then collectible personal use assets. Now, that first link is that tax determination that identified from the get-go that Bitcoin is a personal use asset. Right now, clearly, it couldn't be introduced, or could have, but the regulator made the, I think, better choice to identify it as an investment and a CGT style investment, versus trying to put it in from an SMSF point of view as a collectible and personal use asset. And the link to me would be that last point that I've got bolded there: assets of a particular kind, if assets of that kind are ordinarily used or kept mainly for personal use or enjoyment. So that's what's defined in the SIS Act as to what a personal use asset is going to be. So, you know, there is scope for the regulator via, or the tax office, treasury, or whatever, via the regulations, to expand this definition and to include cryptocurrency or crypto assets into this broader collectible and personal use asset subset of regs. Now, by doing that, what you do is you introduce absolute storage requirements. You introduce absolute insurance requirements. Now, I know reading, I'm not sure if it's BTC markets or Coinbase or CoinStock or one of these various markets that deal in Bitcoin, but I know that some of them provide insurance for the holdings in this space. But I suspect that those that hold it via cold wallet, they have no insurance over it. And of course, if they lose their password or they lose their cold storage, then that's lost to the fund as a loss of the value from an investment point of view. But the collectible and personal use assets, so we have already this distinction for our jewelry and coins and medallions and banknotes. We understand that they are CGT style investments, but we have this strict set of guidelines around these investments that identify that they can't be used by a related party. They can't be stored at the premises of a member or relative. They can't be displayed, right? So you can't have the banknotes or the medallions, whatever, up in nice display for other people to see. You can, of course, have them on display at a museum or somebody else and them leasing it, as long as you're not related to that museum. So you've got all those other sorts of things to contemplate. But when we take this a step further and we start to address sort of the broader definition of collectible and personal use assets, you know, we're talking about, and this comes back to my 50-cent piece conversation before, that coins and banknotes are collectible if their value exceeds their face value. So that for us is the first determining factor of, say, between dealing with gold and silver, whatever, versus a collectible and personal use asset, is that we've always got a spot price for gold. Right? And so that spot price for gold is what we can utilize from an administrative point of view to put a valuation in for our 30 June. And again, subject to how we hold these investments, you know, whether we hold it through one of the various mints or golden bullion style businesses in Australia, then we can provide the necessary storage and other requirements there. But what's interesting, and I've spoken about them a few times, and so I thought it would be worthwhile putting on this page to discuss at this point, is this concept of non-fungible tokens. So these things were introduced probably from my research into about 2014 is when they first came to fruition. But they are in effect, so Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are in effect a means of exchange, right? And effectively what you do there is you exchange them, you exchange your Bitcoin for another Bitcoin or whatever it might be. And it's like, I've seen the simplest example, it's like taking a $20 note and changing it for $4 or $5 notes. You've still got $20, right? But you're actually changing it. And so with cryptocurrency and blockchain and the private addresses and the private keys and public keys, the way that they are identified can change. So once the transaction goes on to through the blockchain technology and the transactions are recorded, then the private address for that Bitcoin will change to represent the new holding or where it's actually being undertaken. Non-fungible tokens effectively assign a private address to a specific asset, and that specific asset, being a digital asset, will always have the same private address. So in effect, you cannot exchange it for something else. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, because I'm not quite sure which word, so I'll just keep it as tidy as possible from a concept point of view. What we're seeing in the last month or so is artists, and more importantly, digital artists, selling original pieces of digital art. And I don't know how you create original pieces of digital art, but let's just say that it is possible, because there is one, and they go by the name Beeple. So Beeple is his art name. Beeple used to sell art for $100 a piece. Now, can you tell me how much he sold his recent NFT piece of art through the crypto exchange process?
Yeah, so Beeple's latest piece of artwork, which was an NFT, sold for $69 million.
Yeah, so a little bit of a discrepancy between a $100 piece of art and a $69 million piece of art. But what it is people are creating content online or digital content, and then selling effectively the capacity to own that original content, which you can then share and reproduce and do other things with, but you would be assigned as the owner of it. You don't have the licensing over certain things, so the original creator still has the licensing to that art, but it's like effectively a digital version, the original Mona Lisa, being owned by one crypto asset owner. And this is what non-fungible tokens are. And so it is effectively digital, collectible and personal use assets that will be created or are being created. And at the moment, we're seeing it mainly as art, but we're also seeing it in video footages of, I know the NBA and basketball teams have their own channel and their own capacity to create exclusive digital content that people can own. I know the owner, or the guy that is Twitter. I'm not sure if it's that Jack Dorsey or whatever his name is. I always get the names of all those billionaires wrong. He sold his original tweet, and this just blows my mind. He sold his original tweet, which I don't know what to say. Hey Twitter, I don't know what his original tweet, for $3.8 million. Now, I could probably go back and view his original tweet and take a screenshot of that for free. And so this comes back to this concept that we were talking about before, is that the value associated with these sorts of things suggests that we will see people trying to enter into these transactions, and we need to be able to identify the address. And so I think they will be very secure and verifiable. So we'll be able to verify who owns these investments, these artworks, these digital pieces of art, these digital drawings, whatever they might be. We will be able to see that the self-managed super fund owns them from that point of view. But then the problem is they must be, there's no way around it to me, they must be identified as collectible and personal use assets from a regulatory point of view. And so then when we start to talk about the storage requirements, because implied in the requirements for a self-managed super fund to hold collectible and personal use assets is the requirement to store those assets somewhere other than your primary residence, right? So if you've got your cold storage USB, then you're going to need to look at storing that in a vault off-site or something like that. So you can't carry it around in your pocket. You will need to make sure that you go to the extreme of hiding your piece of digital art inside a little digital wallet inside a bank vault, right? And so unless we get to the point where, and look, I'm now well and truly outside my comfort zone of what I'm actually saying. This next sentence is just popped into my head, but ultimately we will be suggesting that will self-managed super funds be leasing digital art to digital or virtual galleries for other people to view. And whilst that might sound like an extreme sort of comment to make, that's the virtual reality and reality of these sorts of investments, and we're going to have to start to get our heads around it sort of sooner rather than later. So it becomes a fairly significant piece. And so whilst a key point of today's presentation was really to identify for you all that there are regulatory issues around collectibles, personal use assets versus gold bullion, which we're touching on in a moment, and the link then to cryptocurrency, and we'll finish off with the audit requirements for each and how they differentiate from cash, is also a bit of a push towards the future and what do these assets hold in the future. And if cryptocurrency is anything to go by, you know, the nature and the fluctuation of it that we've seen over the last sort of eight years specifically, but certainly over the last couple of years, where we saw the big spike up and then the big drop off, and again over the last few months, big highs and then a 20% drop off over the weekend and things like that. It's a roller coaster, but from a regulatory point of view, we need to be ready for and ready to deal with that. And so when we jump back into, let's call it a little bit more normality from an existing investment point of view, and we're talking about precious metals, that we do need to appreciate the difference between the requirements for collectibles versus bulletins, and that is bullion. And that is that our collectibles do have protocols which are defined in our regulations. So if you are holding precious metals, banknotes, coins, there will be different rules around it. And the main thing is around storage. Now, you know, I'll get Carl to briefly tell us about some of the clients that hold bullion in their self-managed super fund. What have you seen funds do with regards to the holding of bullion?
Yeah, with the holding of bullion, we have a lot of clients that will use someone like a bullion dealer.
Yep.
They might use a bank vault, but then there's also a large number that will store it at home as well at their personal residence. So it's something that it's a question that comes up a lot. Can that bullion be held at home?
Right. And what's how do we answer? I mean, because to me the answer should be no, right? It should be no, but clearly because it's not a collectible and personal use asset, the answer isn't no. So what do we require and what do we provide from an audit satisfaction point of view in that space?
Certainly, when a client's holding bullion at home, when it comes to audit time, we're generally asking them for a photograph of all the bullion. And in that photograph, we also need to be able to see the current day's newspaper. So that way we're confirming the photo is current. It's not an old photo being recycled. We're also going to be asking for some sort of valuation guidance and a declaration that the investments are held for the super fund.
Right. Okay. So, look, it's a tough one, I guess, but I guess it's a matter, and there's nothing to suggest again that the auditor won't qualify their report with those sorts of investments. But you know, distinguishing between gold bullion, being it ingots, bars, whatever it might be, versus say banknotes and coins, which have some form of value associated with them, or jewelry and things, how there are different rules associated with how they are actually held, and some of those are actually regulated and create certain issues. So again, we've got our precious metals fact sheet, which is a good guide in that space. And so I guess I wanted to finalise this by saying, and this is a very broad comment about the conversations we have with our auditors, but largely represent, I guess, the key issues that we want to see from satisfaction of the audit requirements. And that is that we obviously want to see transaction statements to confirm acquisitions and disposals. And so clearly with Carl's commentary around hot wallets, but also my comments around, say, some of the bullion providers, and that be ABC, Perth Mint, one of those, as an example, that there's a number of them out there. You can be provided with the transaction statements, obviously obtain the spot prices with the various online registries for cryptocurrencies. They will have valuations, end of day valuations that can be necessarily relied on. From a cold wallet point of view, what are we asking for? What are we wanting to see in regards to cold wallets, Carl?
Yeah, of course. So with cold wallets, we're often going to be asking for a copy of the public key so we can see the transactions right up until that cryptocurrency was transferred to the wallet.
Yep.
Or asking for a screenshot of what's held on there. And we're going to want to see the date and time on the computer as well, again, so we can confirm that it's not being recycled. Similar to that, we'll also be using another declaration confirming that those investments are held for the SMSF. We're also going to be asking on that declaration where the wallet is stored. So is it stored at home or elsewhere?
Right. So, and so that goes a long way to satisfying the auditor. And obviously then the other thing that the auditor absolutely wants to see is they want to see that the deed provides for these non-standard investments. Now, how specific that request is from the auditor with the clauses within the deed is obviously going to vary based on the wording contained within a deed versus exclusions and prohibitions and things. But also, as we touched on from the very beginning, the investment strategy. And I would think that regardless of the size of crypto investments or whatever that a fund is going to invest in, the auditor is going to want to see some level of recognition that the trustee has an understanding and appreciation for that type of investment, and undertaking it in accordance with their investment objectives. And the final point there being about insurance and documentation. So particularly for our collectibles, where we have to have that information of where it's stored, and the insurance held on it, and that those insurances are held in the name of the self-managed super fund trustees. So they're obviously pretty critical guides for us. So, to wrap it up, obviously not all these cash and monetary based investments are created equal. We do need to understand the acquisition rules around it, and we need to understand the audit requirements. But we also need to understand, and just, I guess, to tidy it up, we also need to understand the disposal requirements. So we need to appreciate that for collectible and personal use assets, if we are selling them to a related party, that we need to get a qualified independent valuer to undertake the valuation before we can undertake that disposal. But also that all of these assets, other than cash, other than Australian currency, ultimately, cannot be used to make pension payments. So we can do benefit payments, and I think you said before that we've had someone do a benefit payment in cryptocurrency. No issue with that, but it can't be done if it's a pension payment. And then the future is going to throw up some challenges. So there's going to be regulatory change. I can foresee it just because of these non-fungible tokens. I mean, there has to be some form of regulatory change or contemplation of that. Will cryptocurrency ever be treated as money? Again, you suggest that has to happen. Not saying we want it to, but you suggest that it just is a natural progression for these investments. And then the whole concept about digital collectible items. How far does this progress? Is it just a flash in the pan and people will stop paying $4 million for a tweet, and $70 million for a piece of art that's probably not worth $70 million? And so that then all fits back to that overriding position that we started with, which is the sole purpose test. And I think the key to particular things like digital collectible items is that probably has some emotional value. Like, I own the first tweet ever, right? Awesome, something to brag around the barbecue. But does somebody want to be the second owner of that tweet? And will they pay appropriate valuation from a self-managed super fund? All those sorts of things are pretty key to understand. So Thanks for attending today's webinar. Carl, thank you very much for joining me and explaining some of the elements that for me, I get a little bit lost and a little bit confused, and I think purely in temperature terms, not in execution terms for Wallet. So I appreciate that. We haven't had too many questions, but by all means, if you've got any questions, and you can always send them through to education@superguardian.com.au, and happy to answer those as part of the CPD process as well. As I said, we'll send through the CPD certificate and the fact sheet on. We'll probably send the gold and silver one through as well when we send it through, and a copy of the presentation. But thanks very much for joining us, and we look forward to you joining us on our next presentation in May, where I'll start touching on property development in self-managed superannuation fund and other property style investments. So thanks. Have a great day, everybody.